To improve security, we have some options of restricting remote access and even direct access to our ESXi hosts using a feature of lockdown. In this nugget, we'll take a look at what those features are and then get some practice in the hands-on lab in both implementing and verifying lockdown. Let's begin. Let's you and I consider just for a few moments the various ways throughout this course so far that we've been able to access our ESXi hosts. Initially, we used the direct console user interface to access the ESXi hosts, and that was good for a while. It's also, by the way, good for troubleshooting if, for example, the vCenter server appliance or our management PCs can't reach those devices. So the direct console user interface is great for troubleshooting. Another option that we've used through this course to manage our ESXi host primarily is using vCenter. And the way we're leveraging that is we connect from our management PC over to the vCenter server appliance, where vCenter server is running, and then in vCenter, we added each of the ESXi hosts so they can all be managed by vCenter server. And that's great for us because we have one pane of glass, the vSphere web client. Fantastic. Another option that we've used from our management PC to go directly to each of the ESXi hosts is the host client. And we've used that a couple of times. Once was when vCenter server wasn't even running as the VM on this host. So we used the host client to go check out the status of the host and to make sure that the vCenter server appliance was running. And it wasn't, so we had to start it, and then also modify some settings for auto start regarding that vCenter server appliance. So we have the DCUI directly at the console. We have vCenter for centralized management. We have the host client to go directly to each ESXi host from our management computer. And we also have the CLI. Now the CLI is available in a couple flavors. We could be right at the direct console user interface and do an Alt F1 to get the CLI, or we could use a remote access tool such as SSH to get a CLI directly with each ESXi host. And for that remote access, that also presumes that we have SSH enabled as a service running on each of the ESXi hosts, and also that we have the shell enabled on each of the ESXi hosts that gives us the bash shell that we can log in through. So the question may come up, well, Keith, what do all these different access methods have to do with lockdown mode? And the answer is we can restrict most of these access methods if we want to for security reasons. For example, if we do not want to allow individual management of our ESXi host, for example, through the host client or through an SSH session with CLI, what we can do is we can knock all that out and turn it off simply by enabling lockdown mode on each of our ESXi hosts. And once we enable lockdown mode on each of the hosts, the intention is that the centralized management can only be done through vCenter and not by a management computer that's getting direct access. So lockdown mode would wipe out the CLI if it was accessed via SSH. It would knock out the host client, so it would no longer be able to be used. And virtually the only access that we'd have to each of these ESXi hosts would be through vCenter, and also in normal lockdown mode, we also still have the direct console user interface. And we can also take this a step further with lockdown with a mode called strict. And with strict, we're effectively saying all we want is vCenter and vCenter only to be able to go ahead and manage our ESXi hosts. So in addition to all the other restrictions that we've already talked about, strict mode disables the service of DCUI. So even if we showed up at the console and tried to log in with F2, it would simply say, sorry, the DCUI service isn't even running on the ESXi host. And what we get to do right now is we'll walk through the lab, we'll do a little demonstration of what it looks like without lockdown mode, then we'll turn on normal lockdown mode, take a look at those results, and then we'll turn on strict and compare our findings there as well. And then after we go through this together in this nugget, I'd like you to practice in the hands-on lab to reinforce the concepts and also to build your skills in working with lockdown mode. For our demonstration, let's start off at the direct console user interface on ESXi 3. So let's go ahead and click inside this window in our lab environment to give the focus to this screen, and let's press F2 to log in. We'll log on as root, we'll use the down arrow, and supply our lab password. And with that supplied, we'll press enter. It brings up the system customization menu. And before we configure lockdown, let's go ahead and just do the down arrow and go down to troubleshooting options, just to take a look at the current settings regarding the ESXi shell and SSH to see whether or not they're enabled. So we'll go into troubleshooting options, and at the moment, the ESXi shell is enabled because that's how we left it. And if we use the down arrow, SSH is also enabled. So here I just wanted to confirm the status of the ESXi shell and SSH. Currently they are both enabled because we enabled them in a previous nugget. In a production environment, unless you're using those features, you'd want to leave them in their default state of off, which is more secure. So for now, they are both enabled. If we press escape one time to go back one menu, and then we use the up arrow key and select configure lockdown mode and then press enter, currently lockdown mode is disabled. And if we were to go ahead and hit the spacebar to put an X there, and then press enter to save it, that would enable lockdown mode. Now, before we enable lockdown mode, let's just verify some basic functionality first. I'm going to press escape, and let's go to our management computer in the lab environment. And from here, on DCNUG, our Windows computer, let's go ahead on the left-hand side and double-click on the shortcut here for PuTTY. And then if we double-click on ESXi3, it'll go ahead and launch an SSH session from our management computer directly over to ESXi3. So we'll double-click on ESXi3. We can log on as root. We'll supply our lab password, press enter. And there's 3 reasons that this is working. Number 1, SSH is enabled. Number 2, the shell is enabled on the ESXi host. And number 3, lockdown mode is not yet on. So if we type in exit and exit this shell, and now let's go ahead and enable lockdown mode and compare the results. So we certainly could go back to the DC UI and enable lockdown mode. That would work because the option is right there in the menu. We could also do it from the vSphere web client. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and launch the vSphere web client. There's a shortcut on the desktop right here for it. And we'll log on as administrator at nuggetlab.com with our lab password to bring up the interface. So here in the vSphere web client over on the left, let's go ahead and click on ESXi3 to select it. And then regarding ESXi3, let's click on the Configure tab right here. And I'm going to go ahead and collapse storage and collapse networking just by using the little icon to the left of those titles. Collapse virtual machines. And what I want to focus on right here is under System, and specifically the Security Profile under System. So we'll click on Security Profile. And by default, it's showing us a list of firewall settings for incoming connections and outgoing connections. Let's go ahead and use the little arrow next to incoming connections under firewall to collapse that. And then we'll also collapse the outgoing connections by using the little icon just to the left of outgoing connections. And that's just going to make it easier to make sure we're looking at the same information as we go through the lab together. So currently, regarding this security profile and the services that are running, the direct console user interface is running, and the ESXi shell and SSH are also both running because we set them up to do so in a previous nugget. And if we scroll down just a little bit below services, here we have lockdown mode, which, when enabled, prevents remote users from logging on directly to this host. So if we want to modify the lockdown mode here regarding ESXi3, we'll simply click on Edit. And then if we want to enable normal lockdown mode, we simply click that radio button, which basically means any type of remote access for management outside of vCenter is going to be denied access. But we'll still have access if we go directly to the ESXi host and use the direct console user interface. So with the normal lockdown selected, we'll click on OK. So now in lockdown mode, it shows enabled, normal, as opposed to strict. And let's do some testing once again. So I'm going to press F11 to take my browser out of full screen mode. I'm going to minimize my browser. And then let's go ahead and launch PuTTY one more time using the shortcut over here on the left of the desktop. And we'll go ahead and connect to ESXi3 by double-clicking on it. We'll log on as root. We'll supply our lab password, press enter, and we get the message, access denied. Not because our password was wrong, simply because lockdown mode has been enabled and it's not allowing remote access connections to this ESXi host. Even though the services of SSH and the ESXi shell are running, lockdown mode is preventing us from connecting remotely to this ESXi host. So let's close our PuTTY window, and we'll confirm that we want to close it. Another option that will not work in lockdown mode is the host client. For example, we have a shortcut here on the desktop in the upper left for ESXi1 host client. If we double click on that just to get the URL up, and then we replace the tail end of it. Instead of going to 101, let's go to 103/UI, which is the URL we're going to use for the host client from our PC going over to ESXi3. So with that URL in place, 192.168.1.103/UI is saying, hey, I don't trust, says the browser, I don't trust the digital certificate that ESXi3 is providing. And that's because it's not signed by somebody that our browser trusts as part of PKI. And that's okay for the lab. We'll click on Advanced, scroll down, and we'll click on the link for Proceed to 192.168.1.103 at the bottom. We'll go ahead and attempt to log on as root to ESXi3. We'll supply our lab password, click login, and once again we have confirmation that it's just not happy with it. It doesn't want us to log in remotely because lockdown mode is enabled. Now let's go back directly to the console of ESXi3, and we can use our lab controls over on the right hand side to do that. So back at ESXi3, because now we're directly connected at the ESXi host, if we press F2 here, we'll log on as root, we'll hit the down arrow, supply our lab password, and with that supplied, press enter, and it's letting us in. And there's three basic reasons why we can still log on via the direct console user interface. Number one, the direct console user interface service is still running. Number two, lockdown mode, normal lockdown mode, doesn't prevent us from using the DCUI. And third, there's also a special access list called DCUI.access that has a list of users that are allowed access via the DCUI, and root, the user root, is on that list. So the other option that we can do with lockdown mode is strict. And with strict, it has all the other restrictions that we already talked about, plus it disables the DCUI service. So no matter who the user is, they're not going to get DCUI access because the service simply isn't running. So let's do this. Let's press escape to go ahead and log out from the DCUI. And now let's go back to DCNUG, our Windows management computer, and let's enable strict lockdown mode. So I'm going to close the tab for the host client that was connecting or trying to connect to ESXi3. We'll close that tab. And then here at the vSphere web client, with ESXi3 selected on the left, the configure tab selected, and with security profile selected, let's scroll down a little bit. And let's go ahead and click on edit across from lockdown mode, and we'll change it from normal to strict. Now, before we do that, I want you to be aware that under services, the direct console user interface at the moment is running. And once we enable strict lockdown mode, the DCUI service will not be running at all, which makes it impossible to use. So we'll click on edit across from lockdown mode. We'll choose the radio button of strict, which is warning us that the direct console user interface will be stopped. We'll click on OK. Then we'll click on OK to confirm. Give the interface a moment to refresh itself. If we scroll down, we can go down and verify that it's currently set for strict, which it is. Also notice that the under services direct console user interface is no longer running. And also, while we're here, if we wanted to enable or disable SSH or the ESXi shell, we could also do it right here across from services. Simply click on edit and then simply edit the service that we want to either start or stop. And we can also control whether those services are automatically going to be started with the host or if it's a manual option. So I'm going to click on cancel here. And I also want to point out one more thing regarding lockdown mode. If we click on edit across from lockdown mode one more time, even though we have these lockdown options of normal and strict, we also have an option of exception users. And the exception users list wouldn't be for like a traditional user like an admin, but rather it'd be an account that's used by third-party solutions or external applications that still need access to the ESXi host to do their functionality, even if the host has lockdown mode enabled. So in the lockdown mode settings, that's where we'd also enable our exception users or add them if we needed that for a third-party solution. So I'm not going to add any exception users here. We'll click on cancel. And also, while we're right here, let me share with you one other thing that's under advanced system settings. So ESXi3 configure under system, advanced system settings. If we do a filter here in the advanced system settings, and let's filter for DCUI, simply by typing it in this field and pressing enter, here's a list called DCUI.access. So if we were in normal lockdown mode, which means the DCUI was still running, and if we wanted to provide a list of usernames that could access the DCUI while in normal lockdown mode, we could go ahead and put them here. And by default, the root user is on that list for DCUI access. So if we go back to the security profile and confirm that lockdown mode is currently set to strict, let's go ahead and test that. Let's go back to ESXi3 directly through the lab interface. And here, let's go ahead and click the mouse in this space to make sure it has the focus. Press F2, and it doesn't even give us the chance to log on. It simply says direct console access has been disabled by the administrator for this host. And the only thing we can do is press OK to dismiss that message. In this nugget, we've taken a look at the lockdown mode options, which are disabled, normal, and strict. And I invite you to practice what we've covered in this nugget in the hands-on lab. So have some fun, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.